close it here just to avoid any issues. Yeah, it looks like it's okay. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana wa zidna ilman bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. It's a pleasure to see everyone. I'm going to take a slightly different tack to the two presentations before. So, as a bit of background, I work predominantly with young people, professionally and voluntarily. We've been, since a young age, I've been working in the National Youth Agency and UK Youth Parliament, so I've seen the non-Muslim side, and I've also, alhamdulillah, been blessed to work with young people. I've never met a young person who's too far gone, or someone that's heart is not in the right place, and I think often we sometimes struggle to see the woods from the trees when we're their parents, but when they're in a different environment, they can transform and they can be in a different way. So my talk's going to be a slightly more practical example, looking at some of the things that I've kind of mentioned. I've already started some of the polls. I skipped this slide previously, but there will be some. I like to keep my talks interactive. Some of the things will be kind of more confidential questions, so you can feel free to participate if you wish, inshallah. So I went through this before. I think for shortness of time I'll skip it, but it's just to kind of survey how many teenagers you actually have. And I will repeat this actually because I'm curious to see, so now there's a bigger audience. So you can join in by going to this website vvox.app, www.vvox.app. You type in this code and just tell me how you generally find your behavior of your children. So 1 being very difficult, 5 being amazing. And I've got some definitions there in case it's a bit more arbitrary because everyone's definition is different. So generally speaking, how do you find the behavior of your children? Inshallah, those online can also participate. Is it streaming okay? It is, but I think that would be more complex for people.
So we go to the website and then...
So go to the website www.vvox.app. Apologies, it's quite small. I'll write it on the board. And then the code is...
This is the inter-session ID, right?
That's the session ID here.
Yeah.
Yep. So, of course, I've kind of put questions in here and there, but it's just mainly to see the perception of people so that I can tailor things. If you're all on a 5, then we can finish early and go home. If you've got other pressing issues like 1, we've got Dan and my dad on hand, and inshallah somewhere in between we can deal with it. Okay, I'll give it a few more seconds just to kind of respond. Now you can leave it open because there will be more questions later on, inshallah. Okay, I'll finish it there. So the results have changed a little. I think the early comers had very good children that let them come early. There's a few more people who found it often hard, but some good things, good times. But I actually personally feel, if we were talking about that bell curve, I think most people assume that most teenagers are okay, and then it kind of goes either way. My experience is actually more like this. Most people are good. You got a few extremes, and I think there's something called the power of bad. When someone's bad, you really feel they're bad, and it's like you kind of there's probably more of in mathematics a negative skew in that, or a bump, like an anomaly, extremity. But actually, most people generally, their children are okay, and there's some issues, and I think that's a positive mentality to have. Alhamdulillah. And then finally, I wanted to, one more question. How do you feel your children view you? So take all the ones that apply, and I've put some definitions here as well. Do they respect you? Do they see you as their friend? Do they see you with admiration? Do they love you? And do they care as well about you?
You don't have all of the above.
You can tick all the ones that apply. So you can put all 5 if you feel, huh?
Can vary from child to child as well.
Do the general perception. I know that if you have more than one child, it is going to differ, but yeah.
Just a quick clarification. This session is about teenage children.
Yes.
But if I look at this, my children are in the 20s. I've got to be careful because one of them's here. I think that, I mean, I'm in my 50s. But if my parents were alive today, they could answer some of this on my behalf.
I think what I would like you to do, if you have children that are grown up, then you can just look back at how you thought they think of you. And if you have multiple children, maybe give what you think is the average. It's just a friendly survey, I suppose.
There's no answer. They were extremely good until they got married.
No, but this is saying how your children view you. No, the question's asking how they feel about you. So how do my child think about you? So. Okay, so once you've ticked it, make sure you press the confirm button. I'm just curious because I think we often, and this will come up a bit later, but we often don't reflect on the reciprocal, how our children actually view us, and if we had our children in this room, what they would actually say about us as parents.
This is why we said no children, not to embarrass anybody.
There you go. Okay, I'll close the poll. So this is going to be a percentage that applies. So very few of you think your children see you as a friend, or rather half of you don't, which I think is interesting. But most of you feel that your children love you because I've quite deliberately said they're regular displays of affection. So it's not just, oh, they love me, but do they actually hug you? Do you kiss them? Do you have that bond with them as well? But it seems like generally here we have it depends how you see it, glass half full or glass half empty. But I think most people have a good perception of how their children view them. And I think that's an interesting point of view. Having worked with non-Muslims, I don't kind of know whether this would, because this technology didn't exist back then, but anecdotally I know that this isn't necessarily always the case as well. So, a few disclaimers. There is no silver bullet. If you're coming here for a solution to make your children ideal and perfect, that doesn't exist, and it won't be here today. This is all about the process, and enjoying the process and working through the process, because I very much believe that raising a child is actually in and of itself a form of worship, one of the greatest worships, and in its nature, it's meant to test you and try you. Honesty is key. You can't improve things if you don't acknowledge the problem. So thinking back honestly and looking honestly at your own children, and the number of people I've met that think their child is one thing and then their child is another thing is actually kind of beggars belief in sometimes. And then finally, your hard work. No one can do this for you. I've worked with young people for many, many years. I've had many people come and say, can you help my child? My child needs something, etc. We already heard from Dan that the work starts from when they're 1, and you're playing catch-up after. So imagine receiving a 14-year-old where they bring them to the youth group and say, please help my son. It's almost like you're not acknowledging the problem. You're not recognizing the issue here. So, the problems. Start with yourself, your aspirations. If you don't, let's ignore the young people for a second now. And let's say someone's looking at you. I love that analogy, but you said your father, if he was here, what would he say about you? What kind of struggles do you have? What are your aspirations that you want to achieve? What are the struggles that you are going through as a person? Oops. What are your energy levels like? You've got your aspirations, but you come home and you're just tired and you wanted to start that business, you wanted to do that talk, you want to go to the study circle, but you're just exhausted. What are the pressures that you're facing as an adult? With all these different people telling you and expecting you to do different things. Your desires, things that you want to do, things that you maybe shouldn't do, and they are all battling inside you. And then your preferences, things that you like and dislike, things that you want to do and don't want to do. And the reason I say start with yourself is because we assume our children are just some kind of computer program that's going to be ideal. And actually most of our kids are mirrors of ourselves. They're going through the same things as ourselves. And if we expect them to do something that we're not, if we have goals for them that we don't have for ourselves, many a time children are balancing hundreds of different things. They've got their studies, they've got their sports, they've got their peer pressures, amongst all the other concoction of things. And before we talk about anything today, it's really important to realize that they are just human, and your own perception of yourself, your own perception of your struggles are no different to how they are seeing themselves as well. And I think that empathy is going to be perhaps the most important ingredient that we go through today. It's narrated that Imam Ali ibn Talib said, "Do not raise your children just as your parents raised you, for they were created for a generation different than yours." This is perhaps the most important thing. So, back in my day, they just listened. No, they didn't. And you didn't too. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know that that's not the case. Apparently, it's attributed to Socrates as well, this statement. Allah knows best. But it's, as a statement, I think it's probably the most profound thing we can understand. That times have changed. The things that exist now for the kids that I'm dealing with are so different from when I grew up, and I had computers, I grew up with games, and it just feels like a completely different world. So it's very important to recognize that the world is changing and actually live in the world that you're in rather than dealing with other things. So kind of tip number one, or pointer number one, it's really important to understand the world that you're in. So what has changed? Well, I've put 3 categories. Technology is such a huge Pandora's box to open. And I don't think people really understand what that means, what technology means, and what it's going to mean as well. I mean, we're in the precipice. We literally have technology now where I can write a synopsis of what I want to say, and then a robot will write my speech for me. If you're an adult, we're struggling to come to terms with this, but young people are already engaging with these things. You've got robots that are kind of tailoring to their preferences and taking them down psychological wormholes. And leisure has completely transformed. And I think the ingredient of empathy is really important here, because if we're working with our children and with our youth, if we don't embrace and understand that there's so much things that are kind of working against them or things that they're struggling with, if we don't acknowledge the problem, it's going to be difficult. Society, expectations of what's on them, career-wise, behavioural-wise, the culture that surrounds them is just, it feels so foreign to even a few years ago, let alone kind of when we were perhaps younger. And children are having to wrestle with that, the kind of expectations at home versus the things that are going on in school or on TV. And then finally, global concerns. So we, as I often feel as older people, perhaps the most emblematic issue of the lack of empathy is the fact that global warming is still debated, and even if it's not debated, it's not actioned, because that is perhaps the single most important issue for our young people, and I don't even think it's something we register, right? And I think that, to me, is one of the kind of characteristic problems that perhaps we have when we deal with our young people, is we don't acknowledge actually the concerns that they may face or the things that they face. Haram is available in a way that it's never been available before. Temptation is available in a way that it's never been available before, and actually realizing that the world is hard. So finally, I've put mental health, and perhaps it's something that's discussed more and therefore more prevalent, but I would think it's certainly from my experience, there are certainly kind of many studies that show there is just so much more pressure on young people these days. So social media and what that's done to the mental health of people, and how that's actually affecting our youth is not to be remiss. So the 2 things is, number 1, have mercy on your kids, right? The world is having a lot of difficulty, and don't come at your kids like a ton of bricks. There are so many things that are working against them that actually, if we didn't have Allah, you'd think we have nothing on our side, right? Because there's technology, there's companies that are built on taking their attention away from you and making money out of it. And you're fighting that company. right? Kids play computer games. Kids go on social media because they've been built to be addictive. They've been designed that way. I studied with a colleague of mine when I was at university who studied the subject of how to make things addictive in advertising and how to bring people to it. And it's a science. So if you don't acknowledge that and you don't recognize where we're starting from, you don't empathize with the young people, then you immediately falling on kind of an us versus them and the expectations, which are difficult. So just an open question, because I wanted to ask, kind of generally speaking, is there any problems that you've seen that I've missed, perhaps, just as a question? Yeah.
A father on Radio 4 last week said my son was, teachers had concern because he wanted to follow Andrew Tate. And when his son came home, he asked him, why are you following him? He said, he's got beautiful women, he's got a big house, he's got huge cars, he's very successful, he's strong, he's good looking. And he was, I was driving to work in the morning when I heard that. That is today is one of the key concerns, and young Muslim teenagers, boys particularly, are huge, massive followers. Even now he's been arrested and a lot of negative stuff has been revealed so far. They still think of him as something, wow, he's a new hero to follow. That's one of the key.
I was wondering if Andrew Tate would come up, but I think it's, for those of you who don't know, there's this movement that's driving what manhood should be. And there's positive things to it. We shouldn't ignore that. But there's a lot of negativity, misogyny, and negative things around it. So negative influences. It's amazing because before we used to have TV, and at least what's on TV is regulated. But now you have YouTube, and you have no idea what's available there. And they could be watching anyone and anything. I've had, in confidence, young people tell me in the youth group that their own parents who I know and are practicing and so on, they said they're completely disconnected from them. And this boy was confiding in me that he considered leaving Islam. And if it wasn't for some Discord forums where he was discussing about Islam, that brought him back. And I've spoken to the parents, I still think they're none the wiser. And that's not one conversation I've had, right? There's a few. So where and what your children are consuming is actually terrifying in many ways, and I think it's important, which we'll come to inshallah. Is there anything else? I was just curious if there's any other issues I missed.
I wanted to highlight the fact that you've covered everything, but what social media has done is mostly instant gratification.
Yeah.
To not just children but everybody, and I think that has actually doubled the peer pressure when they go into, especially that big jump they make from primary to secondary school.
Yeah.
More than just teenage and adolescence, it's a change of environment, right? From jumping from primary to secondary, there's a lot of peer pressure, and that's like increased because this instant gratification, do this, you get a like, and so they want to mimic that in the real world.
Sure, and I think that kind of speaks to a lot of kind of the things we've said. Do you have your hand up?
Just to add to the point, linked to the point my brother made, just the intensity of the reactions of these children, even their aspirations, intensity of aggression sometimes. And I know I'm just about to rephrase what the brother said about to see this role model. Let's forget his name, but the boy he liked him because he's got a good-looking woman, big house, nice car. Let's take all of that away. If you're young, you want a nice house, nice car, good-looking partner. There's nothing actually wrong in wanting that. But what they are seeing is like having the biggest house, the biggest car, the 10 women or something. It's the intensity and extreme nature of it that is shocking, I think, to us as adults.
So everything's become amplified,
yeah,
and everything's almost more intense. And it's I gave a khutbah on this once, but the most dangerous kind of truth is the half-truth. Right, it's when you build something its premise is okay, but you don't realize you're taking it too far or going too far with something. So that's fair.
It's still a challenge of being a Muslim in Western society, I think.
Okay. Can you elaborate?
I think depending on where you live and maybe the social circles you have or the mix of children in schools, but I think some of the conversations we had as kids 30, 40 years ago, they still happen, but on top of that, you've got social media, you've got things that the kids, I was surprised at secondary school talk about 9/11 with Muslims and make references to that, and suicide bombing. I don't know why, it's in that generation, but it seems to be there prevalent. And I don't think it's easy growing up as a Muslim kid nowadays. It wasn't before, and it's definitely not got easier, in spite of the increased prevalence of Muslims. So perhaps living in Birmingham and starting hard, you'd think it wouldn't be a problem, but I think it still is.
So that's a very interesting point. How many, just as a show of hands, how many of your kids feel they struggle with their faith identity in there?
I don't think they struggle with it, but I think it's a constant challenge.
It's a constant challenge.
It's not gone away. I think some of them are more confident.
I think it's a big
in
number,
Muslim
actually.
identity, but it's not gone away.
Okay.
So for us, thankfully, when Yusuf and Ismail were young, we put them into church union school. There wasn't any Muslim facilities at all.
Need another 15 minutes. چی 15 دقیقه.
And then having Sunday school would reinforce that. And what I've seen is that Yusuf and Ismail have very strong identity as Muslim, so much so that they went into the Church of Union school and, proudly talked about being Muslim. What surprised me was that when it came to the end of junior school, that Yusuf had said that there was a lot of peer pressure being applied on him and everybody in his year to have a girlfriend. And thankfully we talked about that, and that sort of, I think, highlighted that actually it's not, you're not home and dry, that there's going to be challenges that need to be navigated through tactfully, because I'm quite mindful that if I say having a girlfriend is wrong, then I'm denying the physiological desire and pleasure that comes with that and so on. So I have to explain it
Sure.
in a different way. So I think when I was growing up in Sparta, that was really a thing. We knew if you did that, there'd be a slipper waiting for you at home, because somebody would have told before you got home, and you were surrounded by a majority Muslim. So girlfriend boyfriend thing was not a thing.
Okay.
Just want to make some adjustment. When we actually thought of the subject, and usually Islamic subjects, people come for an hour or an hour and a half maximum, so we put 2 hours including the Salah. But the fact that 3 days after the advert, 50 places were booked, so that gave an idea. That's 3 subjects which is needed. And having more than 50, we thought will reduce the interaction, which now proven correct. It should have been a full day seminar, 6 hours at least, because that will allow you to really understand. I had to rush my presentation because I was late. Not my fault, but by fault of my watch. Anyway, I'm always right. But okay. So would you like us to extend half an hour? Because some of you might have their children in care, and husbands might not cope, and then we'll start. Or wives. So half an hour will be fine? Yeah? Agreement? Okay.
Okay.
And it needs 15 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes to get the 3 of us and answer questions, inshallah.
Okay, I'll wrap it. I'll close that bit. But it's interesting. I love discussions, interactions, inshallah. So here I've tried to kind of categorize things. So I actually put Islam as I shouldn't say Islam's a problem. That's not what I mean. But the problems that you can face as a parent is laziness in practice, in some kind of order, and it goes all the way to perhaps doubting Islam. I forgot to put an example there, but asking difficult questions. And just kind of salah, etc. I've separated sin because I feel that's its own category, and that starts with kind of perhaps bad character, and it can go all the way to kind of crime and addictions. The statistics on pornography are astonishing for male and for female. A child, I think it's 1 in I think it's like 80% of children see it by the age of 14. It's often, in fact, unintended. It pops up. Instagram is horrific. at this. Any picture-based social media is horrific, and it's often involuntary that it pops up. And I think if we feel or we believe our children are not seeing it, then we are sadly living under a rock. Give me 1 second. Family, so distant from parents, how the relationship between the father and the son, the child and the mother. Studies, I know a lot of parents have anxieties around their children's education, playing too many games, using too much social media, other problems at school like bullying and fighting. I've had at least 4 or 5 different families in the last 2 months, Muslim families complaining that their children are fighting with other Muslim families at school. And that's maybe a COVID thing that's happened, which brings it to kind of friends and bad influences. So bullies or being bullied or struggling to make friends or interact and socialize with people. And then finally relationships, kind of girlfriend, boyfriend, free mixing, other kind of challenges that surround that. So I try to, in a slide, categorize the types of problems you might be having as a parent. These are kind of some of the things that I've seen. And I'd like to say that the discussion kind of threw up some of these issues. So,
Is there sleep anywhere? Lack of sleep anywhere in there?
lack of sleep.
Yes, they don't sleep very well.
I would say I've not put it there, but I probably should have. But mental health issues more broadly, and I did kind of consider that, but I kind of maybe I probably should have added that actually. So I'll skip this for now because of time. Just kind of wanted to survey what people's experiences were. Now, I like to be very practical and give some tips and tricks for you to do, because knowing the problem isn't very helpful. Knowing what to do with the problem is much more useful for you. The first and most important thing, I think, giving respect is not the same as earning respect. Allah Azza wa Jalla says in the Quran, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ حُسْنًا. Now, any place you see in the Quran, we translate this as respect your parents. It doesn't say respect your parents. What it says is you should be good to your parents. My teacher was explaining this, and he did an example where he said there's a responsibility for the child to behave well to the parents, but there's no responsibility to say they have to respect them. The respect has to be earned. And as a parent, it's important that you earn the respect of your child, that he feels he wants to listen to you because he admires you, because they honor you, they kind of see that in that way. It doesn't mean they should be rude to you, because that's a legal obligation in the Quran. But you can't control something you feel. And that feel, the first point I start with parents is, where are you in their eyes? And how are they viewing you? Because if they love you, if they respect you, all those words I put earlier on, your relationship with your child will be very, very different. So look at your behavior, how you treat your family, how you work practices, the language you use, your character. Similar sort of components there. Your knowledge, the studies and skills. I'll mention my father because even after he retired, he started learning how to cook. He learned philosophy. He learned economics. He invited us to sushi. But as a role model, there's someone that you see someone who's always learning. It inspires you to learn, right? And if you as a parent are not actively in their eyes seeking knowledge, and you expect them to seek knowledge, whether it's tuition, whether it's Islamic studies or anything, it's always going to be a very difficult push. So they will respect you and see you much more than what you do. So these are kind of tips of what to do, how to earn the respect, how to see your children become the ones you want them to be. There's a kind of whole idea of spheres of influence, spheres of concern. The one thing you can guarantee you have control over is yourself, with the tawfiq of Allah Azza wa Jal. If you work on studying yourself, if you work on becoming a good Muslim, then that will immediately perforate around the people around you. So the problems we listed in terms of Islam, lack of practice, lack of knowledge, don't say it but do it. So become the thing you want to see. The number of families that do not pray Jama'ah in their home is astonishing to me. It's something I actually thought was normal until I started mixing with people, and I realized it's actually very uncommon. the number of people who their child prays in his room, mother prays in his room, you will know if your child prays if you pray together. And it's a very simple, practical thing to do as a family. From my experience of working in Muslim youth groups, the number one thing you can do to transform your children is to begin a habit of salawat on the Prophet ﷺ, and to embed in them a love of the Prophet and a love of the companions, and to make them very aware of their stories. Because when you have Sayyidina Umar, you don't need Andrew Tate, right? When you have Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Sayyidina Ali, when you know the Prophet ﷺ, these people become very inspirational to them, and actually creating these role models in their lives are really important. And share the burden. Don't make life difficult for you. Just get a group of friends who are of a similar age, friendship circles, and it's so much easier to have a group of friends motivate each other than it is as a parent burdening down for their children. And then create positive associations. If you want them to do something, just connect it to something they like. So create that reward mechanism that kind of Facebook and gaming use so well. So, for example, you like them going to Sunday school. After Sunday school, make a habit of always stopping in the corner shop and buying some form of sweet for them. And it just builds the association of pleasure, of something they like, with something you want them to do. And then, of course, have conversations at home. Encourage questions and encourage that discussion. You mentioned your son came up to you and said there's pressure to have a girlfriend. I couldn't imagine having such a conversation, just to be honest with you. But it's a difficult one, right? But it's one that the fact that he can do that shows that there's a bond between a parent and a son. And I think if they can't come to you, and the way you said something which is really important, the way you react to it is very important, because if immediately you're repulsed or disgusted or something, then they won't come to you again with that same question. So sin, how do you deal with bad character, bad behavior and addictions? Build a relationship with them. The Prophet, Sayyidina Umar said, play with your son for 7 years, teach them for 7 years, and then befriend them for 7 years. So if you consider the kind of teenage year groups, actually being able to play with them, share in their interests. How many of you have played a PlayStation? How many of you actually know which buttons to press when you're playing a PlayStation? But it's a silly point, but can you imagine the bond you'd have with your child if you can, and how much control you'd have over the gaming time if you played together? You can tell them when to stop, you can teach them to control their anger, you can manage things together because you're sharing with them, right? And actually participating and accepting that this world exists and we have to learn how to work with them around that. Maintain the environment. So for kids growing up, I used to laugh at this when I used to go back home to Syria. They used to think that living in the UK is a certain perception. So it's basically a High School Musical drama, and you've got girls and it's just dancing and it's all this stuff, right? Until they now, ironically, all those Syrian people are now in Western countries, and they're actually like, this is a very depressing world. And this is perhaps, if there's one point I think you should take away, I think this is one of the most important ones. Sin is repulsive. When you create an environment at home that's very wholesome, they might rebel from it initially. They might even go into sin. But the nature of sin is that it's not attractive. You kind of just feel really down. And what it does is they will remember back home, this is something that's awkward. I'll give you an example. Who's been to like these work socials where there's alcohol? Who's enjoyed them? No, you don't, because you're not used to that environment. So if you can create an environment in your home that is religiously anchored, when they go into these other environments, their natural fitrah takes over. They don't like that. So I actually say to the kids, they go, can we go to prom? I go, you won't enjoy the prom. Like, I guarantee you will not enjoy it. You're constantly thinking, oh, that's haram. You're living in this weird situation. Everyone's drunk out of their head. They're wearing inappropriate things. You don't know where to look. You're better off just not doing it, right? And actually maintaining that so that when they see that the Hollywood isn't actually a reality, they will actually go back to their faith naturally. And I see that time and time again. That's a reason why a lot of kids become very religious when they're at university, because they gain that freedom. They might even experience some of the haram. They realize it's horrible and they just come back. And they naturally find the ISOC because that's what they're familiar with. And then finally, structure is key. This is a point that's going to come up often, but you can't expect them to do something but not give them the tools to do it. I'm often surprised when I come to youth group that how much the kids miss it, because I always feel I'm really strict with them. And when they're around, they're like, oh, I don't want to do something. But what they do is when there's an absence of it, they often miss it. So whilst they might rebel, they actually crave it in the long term. So I'll give you an example. If you ever ask children what they want to do, they'll say, I want a free session, just play games and do what they like. If you do that for 3 consecutive weeks, they start dropping out and they find it boring. Because they think they want something, but actually they need someone to give them that structure and direction to make it much more productive. So how do you overcome these? These are kind of a broad stroke tips for you. I've categorized these 3 things together. Friends and relationships. It's really important to empathize. It's very difficult being a teenager, having all your hormones and not being able to do anything with them. And you're probably not going to be able to do anything with them until you're at least 21, probably 25, 26, and in some cultures even older, right? How do you as a teenage boy have a conversation with someone where they are attracted to a girl, but realistically they're never going to be able to do anything about it until they're older? It's a difficult situation, and I think it's important that, especially with so much visual kind of promiscuity around you, that you just recognize it's hard being a kid and actually having that empathy and having the ability to discuss with them. And then similarly, having that quality of time where you can have a conversation. I'm very aware people struggle sometimes to have a conversation, but I say to my wife, go on walks because it's easy to have talks. Like when you're walking with people, there's something about the legs and the lips. They're related. So just go on a long walk around the block with your child and you'll find yourself talking. And actually you can have difficult conversations you might not have in your house. Go to their level, I mentioned that before, and be involved in their life and have the patience to see through the awkwardness. Your children will make mistakes. They're probably going to do things they will regret, that they'll be ashamed of. And it's important that they see you as someone who is a balance between a disciplinarian but also someone who has that mercy with their children. And then finally, studies. A big tip is to pair up activities. I love this one. So they love PlayStation. Well, make them listen to a podcast while they're playing PlayStation. So they're using their child brain to play the game, but their adult brain is actually listening to a talk. And even if they pick up 25%, imagine picking 25% up of a talk that you're hearing, and they're playing 3 hours on something or 3 hours on social media. Just force them to have something in the background to listen to. That's probably the way I learned most of my Islamic studies, just having a talk on when I was a kid that we just got used to listening. Giving structure. So you want your children to revise. Most kids don't know how to revise, and actually giving them the tools of what exactly to do and how to do it is really important. So you can put them in classes. They can write questions down. Most people, if you ask them how to revise, for example, what they'll do is they make really pretty notes. And you see their notes and you ask them, what have you learned from it? And pretty much nothing. They've just learned how to colour. What's a much more effective way as a teacher, a much more effective way to learn is actually to write a question based on your notes. So when you read something, write a question with the answer, because you can use it to test yourself later. And what's more important isn't the notes on paper. What's more important is the notes in the head. So write a series of questions, give them a target to read a page and write 10 questions, and then that gives them a very clear target and a clear reward that they can get when they're studying. And then finally, it's very important to have balance in their lives. My university professor, who was probably one of the leading thinkers in economics, said he never worked past 5 o'clock, ever. Like 5 till 8, he would always relax, do what he wanted, and so on. And he trained himself that he works at this point because he knows there's a reward at this point. And it was very kind of clear balance between school life and home life. I think I forgot to change the title there. But it wasn't meant to say balance. It was meant to say kind of their best interest. Most kids know themselves what it is they're actually wanting to aim for. And very few of them will say, you know what, I'm happy just to be kind of a low attaining. I don't want to push myself. I'm demotivated. It's just what they struggle with is how to get to the target. How do they actually do well? And what they want their parents to do is support them in that rather than kind of bashing them if they're not doing well. So, the summary. Tip number 1. I would say relax and trust in Allah Azza wa Jal. The most important part in all of this is there's so much going on in the world. You just have to believe that Allah Azza wa Jal is going to help you. And you have to trust that if you trust in Allah, if you practice your faith, Allah Azza wa Jal will help overcome all these difficulties and your kids will come through regardless of that. Number 2, find hacks to make things easier. I've actually got a whole presentation on kind of hacks that you can do as adults to help make life easier for you as a parent. And then number 3 is take things step by step. It's very much a journey. I recently became a father, and the one thing I noticed is whenever you ask someone about how's parenthood, they always complain, right? Because people have a habit of complaining about the situation. Just take the moment that they are teenagers and this is a process they're going through, and just enjoy that moment. Just be in that moment. Realize this is what they're going through. This is their developmental phase, and realize it's not going to come again. That you can use this as ammunition on their wedding day. There's loads of positive spins you can come up with, but have a step-by-step approach. That it's a journey that's going to get to a destination, not something that you need to get to immediately. Inshallah, Allah knows best. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Jazakallah khair. We are, by the way, if you didn't take handouts, there are still a few on the table. You can take on your way. It's my presentation. We're just going to answer very quick questions if you have. If you feel you need to leave, feel free to leave. But I invite Dr. Jackson, Dan Jackson, and myself and Talha here. So if you have a question, then we'll try to answer it. We might not have time for comments, but quick questions. Yeah, Dr. Said.
I think question really to all of you would be interested. I don't know if there is statistic. What's the situation with a single child in the family? If it's only, would that possibly the risk of mental health will be higher for a child with no sibling, or there's no evidence to support that?
I don't have any particular statistics about only children. But there are certain statistics about having other siblings. So there's a strange study I read recently about if you have 3 girls and then a child with 4 girls. And so I read a study just before I had my 4th girl actually. If you have 3 girls and then a boy, the boy has a high level chance of having mental health issues. Because they're pretty much served by the older girls. So there's definitely kind of interactions with the siblings. So we have, the functional first child, and then you've got the middle children, you've got the younger children. They all have their pros and cons of being in that particular order. But I don't know of any particular studies just on single children within a family home.
It might be, if you think about it from the point of father figure and mother figure, and my grandchildren, the girls, no boy, they will address me like a girl. The problem was slightly difficult when Amar came, and then Rawan came, and they balanced. So they might be missing the sibling figure with his girl. I practiced, I sense this being a grandfather. I have 8 grandchildren now, alhamdulillah. But this is where Islam comes. A lot of kids come to our school and befriend other kids, and that solves the problem in a way. So they have their identified, friend. Whether they are gays, they have, other gays, or boys have other boys, and the problem usually solved when they go to schools. Any more questions? Yes, sister in the back there.
Okay, so is there any association when you were talking about how to deal with the situations with adults in behavior, that the daughters should be dealt with by moms and boys with dads, or there's the opposite is the case? Any association or any statistics about that?
In terms of behavioural problems?
Yeah, behavior correction, the interaction that should come from the parent.
The statistics show that a nuclear family is the best in terms of rearing a child without mental health problems. It's not to say that single parent families can't do it well, that there's not sort of outside of that norm, they can't raise children well, but we know from statistically speaking that children who are raised by a male and female within the same home tend to have better outcomes in their mental health. You know, you can replace that masculinity or that femininity outside of the home. If there's a single parent, for example, if there's just mum in the house, you can have male role models outside, you know, in youth groups or other places, and that complements that. But in terms of general outcomes, having that balanced approach, and as parents, you know, you know, husband and wife together generally co-parent in a way. People will have slightly different parenting skills or different approaches, but you'll have a shared care of values and ethics that you share within the house, and that tends to that if you, as long as you go in that same direction, the femininity and the masculinity is a great balance for a young person. So both the girl and the boy will need balances of those two. It's not just right. Dad says, okay, my daughter, you always go to the mum for problems, and I'll deal with the boys. They both need both.
A quick answer to that. When my daughter was 3 years old, she came to me and said, look, go and ask mom first time, second time, third time, and then dad. You know, the hadith, ummak, ummak, ummak. Any more questions? Yeah?
Yeah, just that kind of, for kids at college level, where from what I've seen and heard, the norm to have boyfriends and girlfriends, how to manage that kind of process for the child, really. I know we've touched on some elements of it, but how to kind of give them the guidance and support.
Yeah, I'll answer that first, and then I'll leave to the experts over there. When I was teaching many years ago now, and I think Talha was in the class, and his age grew. And this came up, and I said, look, in Islam you can marry when you are 13, 14, you can marry. If the girls agree to give you her father's phone number, go and talk to your mom and dad, phone her father. If he agrees to marry his daughter, then Islam doesn't insist on you living together. So you could be living with your mom, and you live with your parents, she lives with her parents, and you meet once or twice a weekend or something. And it's still perfectly halal. In many Arab countries where there's military service by force, they get married and they go to military service. They are allowed 2 days a month to go back, and the wife living with her mom and dad. And then I went home, and then my wife started having the phone calls from, how dare you, her father, your husband said they can marry when they're 30. But the problem diffused with the boys and girls. It's halal in Islam, but there's a lot of rules outside controlling it. So you need to navigate your way around it till you are mature and you have income and you have this, you have that. But it's not haram in Islam, it's halal. But you need to look into father agreeing, and mother agreeing, she agree, you agree, they all agree. There's a lot of, like the one who said, I'm marrying the princess. Oh, are you? I'm halfway through this. Oh, how brilliant. What happened? He said, I agreed, my mom agreed, my dad agreed. Still the king and the queen and the princess. So, what will be your answer?
I do think there's a clash of systems, you know. If people have to go through university and they have to be financially independent and everything in a certain system, but then in terms of when it comes to relationships and romantic relationships, it's a whole different system. That is problematic. That is really difficult. I think there's no real easy answer to it, but I do think creativity around relationships is a must. I think for us as Muslims, you know, if we want our children to be in halal relationships, I think we do have to be flexible and not have this kind of perfect vision for our children that they remain celibate until 30-something, when they've got a job and they've got a house and they've got this and they've got that. I think there has to be some flexibility around it.
When I was in Egypt, I think the average marital age there is something like in the 40s, because a lot of people don't have money. And I was there during the revolution, and one of the things that happened during the revolution is a lot of sexual molestation of women. And there was a lot of men that just do not have, and probably will not have for a very long time, finances to be able to get married. And it was causing a real concern in the society there. And I think creativity around it is really important. Now, what I do with my youth when I speak to them is you have to kind of frame it in the right way. Islam doesn't say you can't have a girlfriend, it says you have to have commitment. That when you're in a relationship, you have to be committed to that relationship, that you're going to stick at it, and this is the person you're planning to be with for as long as you could be with. And that commitment is called a marriage. And we don't have relationships where I'm just going to spend 6 months with you and then I'm going to leave you, because that in itself it causes many family and societal breakdowns. And then in a funny way, I say, look, you're more than happy to have one, but just let me take a picture of you and her, and I'll show it on your wedding day. And everyone, when you tell them that, they're kind of repulsed by it. Even non-Muslims will be repulsed about the idea of bringing up an ex in front of a new partner, because there's an acknowledgement that there's a sense of loyalty when you have a relationship with someone. So what I found with young people is they grasp that, but their mind is different to the heart. And what you have to do is empathize with them on the fact that it is difficult and there are challenges, and society is structured in such a way that you're not going to really be feasibly getting married until you have an income and you can support your family, etc. And let's face it, people who are married and in this society now with the cost of living crisis are struggling to look after their own kids and their own families. So money and finances as a paradigm of needing to get married, etc. There's a lot of tough questions that as a community we probably need to start thinking about. But at the same time, on the flip side, if you had your daughter or your son and you said, okay, we'll put them to get married when they're 14, and with the knowing that they're not necessarily going to be able to stick it through, etc., that also poses challenges. Parents will be like, well, I'm not just going to let them marry, and then the stigma attached to divorce. So it's a very complex question. And I think having the honesty to have that conversation with your kids at least allows them to appreciate it, to know where it's coming from, so that it helps maintain and manage the struggles at least. And then with everything else aside, kind of counselling them and just being a good friend. I know many women in their 30s who would like a romantic partner and just haven't found one. And there's lots of kind of issues surrounding marriage as a whole and kind of these things. So it's a very complex thing. But I think having that conversation, having the ability to kind of counsel them and support them, I think goes a long way.
Who was in Friday prayer this Friday? You were. Because I was thinking, I was stressing a point, Dan, that having promiscuous society and having the sexual freedom made people addict to sexual excitement and getting better. And by the time they get married, they had so many experience that the marriage doesn't succeed, and then go back to previous girlfriend, and then they're not satisfied. They go to the same sex, and then they go to even more extreme, and we are going into slippery slope now in the whole of the world, actually, but especially in the West, when they force the politician to even accept the crazy ideas. I'm today a woman, and you have to accept me to go to the women section, whatever. So, Shan?
Yeah, in terms
Probably
of
this is the last question, then we'll let you go, Shan.
Relationship with your children being more as a friendship relationship, so in the future could be open and honest with you. Do you think having that sort of relationship really helps for future conversations in terms of coming to you with problems, being open and honest? So part of your survey was saying 50% don't see their relationship as a friendship with their sort of like sons and daughters. So what would you suggest? What would you say to that?
I think the key thing with your children is there is a power dynamic that needs to be recognised. So you're not going to be a friend like you are at school.
Yeah.
And you've got lots of different hats that you need to balance. But the key thing when I mentioned be friends with them, even in the narrations we see of other people, is there's a certain age they get to when you lose a certain hold. And actually the final step is you let them roam into the world themselves, right? So there's different development stages and there's different requirements for each of those. And I think they will always see you as an element of a teacher. But the friendship that needs to be there is the ability to approach you unjudgmentally, and actually they can actually have a conversation with you and they can enjoy your company. That you can have jokes, that you're not just the serious person, that you entertain their interests and you nurture them and educate them. I think those sides of friendships I think are going to be really important. But that's ultimately going to be a challenge, because you've also got to be the disciplinarian.
Yeah.
You've also got to educate them. You've got to set boundaries. From my experience with the youth group, for example, is they can kick a fuss, but when you give everything in balance, they always look back and think that's actually a better way to do things. So when they don't always like a study circle type session, they might want to play dodgeball every week. But what you nurture in them is an appreciation of the good, and then you recognize why I have to do this other stuff, why it's there, and having that conversation. So that friendship then becomes a much more wholesome element to it. And yeah, it definitely will help you when they grow up and they have those more difficult struggles. So there was a person I met, and his child asked him something about a girlfriend, and he goes, "Oh, it's haram, we can't do that," and stuff. And I think, sorry, his wife said that, and then the husband came and he said, you've dealt with that all wrong. Because the moment you go, it's haram, and you shut the conversation down, then yes, they already know it's haram, that's why they've come to you. What you want to do is not shut it down. What you want to do is you want to explain. So if they come to you and they go, "Oh, this girlfriend, what's going on with it?" And you go, "Okay, what do you think? What's the pros and cons? Why would you not want to do that? Why would you want to do that?" And it allows them to come to terms with it. And I think that's kind of the attitude to employ with that kind of friendship element. In the same way that if you go to your school friend, they're not just going to start shutting you down. They will often have a conversation with you.
Right. صلى الله عليه وسلم. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. اللهم اجعل اجتماعنا هذا اجتماعا مرحوما وتفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما. May Allah Azza wa Jalla make our meeting blessed and protect us after leaving here. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. I have three choices before